"Daddy, why can't we come home?" My 8-year-old daughter was crying on the phone. The HOA president had changed our locks, keeping my children out of their own house. She picked the wrong family to mess with. I'm a federal judge and now she'll pay the price. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. The sound of my 8-year-old daughter Emma sobbing through the phone will haunt me until my dying day. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Daddy, why can't we come home? Mrs. Patterson says we're not allowed back until you fix everything." I gripped my cell phone so tightly I thought it might shatter in my hands. Standing in my federal courthouse chambers, surrounded by law books and the weight of justice I'd sworn to uphold, I felt utterly powerless. My children, Emma and 10-year-old Marcus, were essentially being held hostage by our HOA president, a woman whose power had clearly gone to her head. "Listen to me, sweetheart," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Daddy's going to fix this. You and Marcus stay with Grandma tonight, okay? Everything will be okay." But as I hung up that phone, I knew nothing was okay. Ann Patricia Patterson, the self-appointed queen of Willowbrook Estates HOA, had just made the biggest mistake of her life. It started 3 weeks ago when I received my first citation. A bright yellow notice stuck to my front door like a scarlet letter, informing me that my lawn was 0.2 inches above regulation height, and my mailbox needed immediate pressure washing. The fine? $200. I almost laughed. Almost. But then I remembered the stories I'd heard from neighbors, whispered conversations about Patricia Patterson's reign of terror. The retired teacher who'd been fined for having the wrong shade of white on her shutters. The young couple forced to remove their children's swing set because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. The elderly man who'd received 17 citations in 1 month for various infractions, each more ridiculous than the last. I should have taken it seriously from the beginning. But I was busy, federal court dockets don't clear themselves, and I had 3 major cases heading to trial. I figured I'd deal with the HOA nonsense when I had time. That was my first mistake. The citations kept coming. My garbage can was visible from the street for approximately 4 minutes past the allowable time. My daughter's chalk drawings on our driveway were considered unsightly modifications to common area concrete. My wife Sarah's herb garden apparently violated the approved plant species list, a document I'd never seen and apparently no one else had either. Each citation came with escalating fines. 200 became 400. 400 became 800. When I tried to call Patricia to discuss the situation reasonably, her assistant, yes, she had an assistant for her volunteer HOA position, informed me that Mrs. Patterson only communicated through official channels. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I was preparing for a complex federal racketeering case when my wife Sarah called, her voice shaking with fury and disbelief. "They've changed the locks," she said. "On our own house. There's a notice on the door saying we're temporarily restricted from occupying the premises due to multiple unresolved violations and unpaid fines." I stood up so fast my leather chair went spinning backward. "They what?" "The kids can't get their school clothes. I can't get my insulin from the refrigerator. Patricia Patterson has essentially evicted us from our own home." The blood drained from my face. Sarah was diabetic, and missing her medication wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. My children were standing on someone else's property, unable to access their own bedrooms, their toys, their sense of security. "Where are you now?" I asked, already grabbing my coat. "At your mother's." The kids are confused and scared. Emma keeps asking if we're homeless now. That's when I felt it, the cold fury that had served me well on the federal bench when dealing with truly heinous criminals. The kind of controlled rage that made experienced attorneys think twice before wasting my time with frivolous motions. Patricia Patterson had just declared war on the wrong family. I took the rest of the week off, something I hadn't done in 3 years. Judge William Morrison was known for his dedication to duty, his impartial rulings, and his 30-year unblemished record on the federal bench. But this week I became something else entirely, a father whose children had been hurt, and a legal mind with unlimited resources and time to burn. My first call was to my old friend Marcus Chin, a private investigator who'd worked with the FBI for 15 years before going private. If there's one thing I'd learned in 3 decades of federal cases, it's that people who abuse power rarely limit their abuse to just one area. "I need everything you can find on Patricia Patterson and the Willowbrook Estates HOA," I told him. "Financial records, complaints filed against her, any lawsuits, any pattern of behavior that might indicate abuse of authority." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Bill, you know I have to ask, this isn't about revenge, is it?" Because if it is. Marcus, I interrupted, my 8-year-old daughter asked me last night if she did something wrong to make the mean lady take our house away. My son hasn't spoken since yesterday. My wife had to go to the emergency room because she couldn't access her medication. This isn't revenge. This is justice. While Marcus worked his magic, I dove into the legal framework of HOAs myself. What I discovered made my blood boil. The Willowbrook Estates HOA had been granted an extraordinary amount of power by the original developers. Power that went far beyond normal homeowner association authority. They could impose fines, place liens on properties, and in extreme cases, restrict access to homes for safety reasons. But here's what Patricia Patterson didn't know. Those powers came with strict legal requirements. Due process, appeal procedures, reasonable notice, proportional penalties. Requirements she'd ignored completely. I spent the next 2 days reading every single HOA document, every covenant, every rule and regulation that governed our community. I cross-referenced them with state and federal housing law, looking for violations. What I found was a masterclass in legal overreach and potential civil rights violations. The HOA rules had been changed 17 times in the past 2 years, all without proper notification to homeowners as required by state law. Fines had been imposed without the mandatory hearing process. The approved plant species list, that supposedly banned Sarah's herbs? It didn't exist in any official capacity. But the real smoking gun came when Marcus called me Thursday evening. "You're going to want to sit down for this," he said. "I've got financial records going back 5 years. Patricia Patterson has been using HOA funds like her personal checking account." I was indeed sitting down, but I gripped the arms of my chair anyway. "How much are we talking about?" Conservative estimate, $200,000. She's been paying herself a salary that was never approved by the board. She's charged personal vacations to the HOA as community research trips. She bought a new car and listed it as a HOA maintenance vehicle. But here's the kicker. She's been charging homeowners inflated fines and keeping the excess for herself. The pieces clicked into place. The escalating citations, the unreasonable fines, the refusal to communicate through normal channels. Patricia Patterson wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme. "Marcus, I need you to document everything. Every transaction, every violation, every instance of financial fraud. And I need it done by Monday." "What are you planning, Bill?" I looked out my window toward Willowbrook Estates, where my children should have been sleeping in their own beds. "I'm planning to remind Miss Patterson that actions have consequences." Monday morning arrived like Judgment Day. I'd spent the weekend preparing meticulously, the way I approached every major federal case. The difference was that this time it was personal. I dressed in my most formal suit, the charcoal gray Armani that had been a gift from Sarah when I was first appointed to the federal bench. I wanted to look every inch the federal judge when I walked into that HOA meeting. The monthly board meeting was held in the community center at 7 p.m. By 6:45, the small conference room was packed. Word had somehow gotten out that something big was happening, and nearly every homeowner in the development had shown up. Patricia Patterson sat at the head of the table like a queen holding court. She was a woman in her early 60s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of pursed lips that suggested she'd been disapproving of things for decades. She wore a navy blazer with an HOA pin prominently displayed on the lapel. She didn't even look up when I walked in. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began in a voice that could cut glass, "we have several enforcement matters to discuss tonight. First, the Morrison property continues to be in violation of multiple community standards." I let her talk. In federal court, I'd learned the value of letting opposing counsel hang themselves with their own words. Patricia Patterson was about to make that lesson very clear. She spent 10 minutes detailing every citation she'd issued against my property. The too long grass, the visible garbage cans, the unauthorized chalk art. She discussed the escalating fine structure, and the necessary enforcement action of restricting access to our home. The room grew uncomfortably quiet. Several neighbors shifted in their seats. A few people glanced at me, but I remained perfectly still, my expression neutral. Finally, Patricia looked directly at me. "Mr. Morrison, as the homeowner in question, you have 3 minutes to respond to these allegations." I stood slowly, the way I did in my courtroom when delivering a particularly significant ruling. The room went dead silent. "Thank you, Miss Patterson. Before I respond to your allegations, I think it's important that everyone in this room understands exactly who they're dealing with." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a leather folder. "My name is William Morrison, and I am a United States federal judge for the Northern District. I have served on the federal bench for 30 years, and in that time, I have overseen more than 10,000 cases involving everything from civil rights violations to federal racketeering charges. The color began to drain from Patricia's face. Now, Miss Patterson, you have accused me of violating community standards. I'm here tonight to inform you, and everyone else in this room, that you have violated federal law. I opened my folder and began reading. Over the past 5 years, you have embezzled approximately $200,000 in HOA funds. You have violated the Fair Housing Act by selectively enforcing rules based on personal grudges. You have denied homeowners their constitutional right to due process by imposing fines without proper hearings. And most seriously, you have violated federal civil rights statutes by using your position to deprive families of their right to peaceful enjoyment of their homes. The room erupted. People were talking over each other, some demanding explanations, others expressing outrage. Patricia Patterson sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. I wasn't finished. Furthermore, I continued, my voice cutting through the chaos, your actions regarding my family constitute what federal law defines as harassment under color of authority. You have endangered the health and safety of a diabetic woman by preventing her access to necessary medication. You have inflicted emotional distress on minor children by making them homeless in their own community. I turned to address the room full of homeowners. How many of you have received citations that seemed unreasonable? How many of you have been charged fines that felt excessive? How many of you have been afraid to challenge Miss Patterson because you thought she had unlimited power over your homes? Hands went up around the room. A lot of hands. Well, let me be very clear about something, I said, my judge voice now in full effect. No homeowner association has the authority to violate federal law. No HOA president has the right to embezzle community funds. And no one, has the right to make children homeless because of personal vendettas. Patricia finally found her voice. You can't prove any of this, she stammered. These are just accusations. I smiled then, the same cold smile I gave defense attorneys who thought they could intimidate a federal judge. Miss Patterson, I've spent 3 decades dealing with criminals who were much smarter and much more dangerous than you. I have financial records, witness statements, and documented evidence of every single violation I've mentioned tonight. I pulled out another folder, this one much thicker. I also have a federal warrant that was issued this morning, authorizing the seizure of all HOA financial records and your personal assets pending a full investigation by the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. That wasn't entirely true, yet. But it would be by tomorrow morning. I had friends in the Bureau who owed me favors, and financial fraud was well within federal jurisdiction. Furthermore, I continued, I have filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against you personally, seeking damages for the harm you have caused my family and other homeowners in this community. The lawsuit includes provisions for punitive damages, attorney fees, and a permanent injunction preventing you from ever holding a leadership position in any homeowner association. Patricia Patterson looked like she was going to be sick. Several board members were staring at her in horror, clearly realizing for the first time the extent of what had been happening under their noses. But I still wasn't done. Now, Miss Patterson, you have exactly one opportunity to minimize the legal consequences of your actions. You will immediately rescind all citations against every homeowner in this community. You will refund every penny of excessive fines that have been collected. You will restore access to my home within the next hour. And you will resign from your position effective immediately. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. If you fail to comply with any of these demands, I will personally ensure that you face the full weight of federal prosecution. I will use every resource at my disposal, every connection I have built over 30 years on the federal bench, to make certain that you spend the next decade of your life in federal prison. I paused, letting that sink in. I have dedicated my career to upholding justice and protecting people from those who abuse their power. You made the catastrophic mistake of targeting my family, but in doing so, you've given me the opportunity to protect every family in this community from your abuse. I closed my folders and picked up my briefcase. You have 1 hour to restore access to my home. You have 24 hours to submit your resignation. You have 1 week to begin making financial restitution to this community. I looked around the room at my neighbors, people who had been living in fear of this woman's arbitrary authority for years. And for everyone else in this room, let this be a lesson. No one is above the law. No one has the right to abuse power, no matter how small that power might seem. And when someone hurts your family, you fight back with everything you've got. I walked toward the door, then turned back one final time. Oh, and Miss Patterson? The next time you decide to take someone's children away from their home, you might want to make sure their father isn't a federal judge with a very long memory and a very short patience for bullies. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through our neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, I actually looked at the houses around me, really looked at them. I saw the perfectly manicured lawns that were maintained not out of pride, but out of fear. I saw the generic landscaping that suggested creativity had been regulated out of existence. I saw a community that had been terrorized into conformity by one woman's hunger for power. That was going to change. My phone rang as I pulled into my driveway. It was Sarah. "Bill, the locks have been changed back. There's a note on the door apologizing for the misunderstanding and saying all fines have been waived." I smiled for the first time in days. "Pack up the kids. You're coming home." Within an hour, Emma and Marcus were back in their own beds. Emma had insisted on checking every room twice, as if she needed to reassure herself that everything was still there. Marcus, my quiet 10-year-old, had simply hugged me and said, "I knew you'd fix it, Dad." But the real work was just beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, everything I had promised came to pass. The FBI opened a formal investigation into Patricia Patterson's financial crimes. The civil rights lawsuit moved forward with depositions from dozens of homeowners who had been victimized by her abuse of power. She resigned from the HOA in disgrace, and the board was restructured with actual oversight and accountability measures. More importantly, the community began to heal. The new HOA board, elected by actual homeowners rather than appointed by Patricia, implemented reasonable rules and fair enforcement procedures. The excessive fines were refunded. The arbitrary citations were rescinded. Children were allowed to draw with chalk on their own driveways again. I also made sure that every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates received a copy of their legal rights regarding HOA governance. Knowledge, I had learned, was the best defense against future abuse of power. 3 months later, Patricia Patterson pled guilty to federal embezzlement charges and was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the community, plus additional damages to the families who had been most severely impacted by her actions. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came 6 months after that terrible night when my children couldn't come home. Emma had organized a neighborhood chalk art festival, and our entire street was covered in colorful drawings created by kids who were no longer afraid to express themselves. As I watched my daughter directing the artistic chaos, I realized that this was what a real community looked like, not the sterile, fear-based conformity that Patricia Patterson had imposed, but a place where families could thrive without constantly looking over their shoulders. Sarah found me standing on our front porch watching the festivities. "No regrets?" she asked, slipping her hand into mine. I thought about that question. I thought about the stress of the investigation, the time away from my federal cases, the emotional toll that the entire ordeal had taken on our family. I thought about Patricia Patterson sitting in federal prison paying the price for her crimes. "None," I said finally. Sometimes the most important cases aren't the ones that make headlines or set legal precedents. Sometimes they're the ones that protect your family and make sure other families don't have to go through what we went through. Emma ran up to us then, her hands covered in rainbow chalk dust. "Daddy, look. Mrs. Chun says she's never seen so many beautiful drawings in one place." I picked up my daughter, this brave little girl who had endured so much confusion and fear because of one woman's abuse of power. "It is beautiful, sweetheart. And you know what the best part is?" "What?" "Nobody can ever take it away from you again." As I held my daughter and watched my son teaching the neighbor kids how to draw three-dimensional boxes with chalk, I realized that justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about restoration. Sometimes it's about making sure that power is used to protect people instead of victimizing them. Patricia Patterson had learned that there are consequences for abusing authority. But more importantly, an entire community had learned that they didn't have to live in fear of those who claimed power over them. And my children had learned perhaps the most valuable lesson of all, that when someone tries to hurt your family, you don't back down. You fight back with everything you have, and you make sure it never happens again. The chalk drawings faded after the first rain, but the lesson remained. In Willowbrook Estates, power would never again go unchecked, and no child would ever have to ask their parent why they couldn't come home. That, I thought as I watched my children play in their own front yard, was what justice really looked like.